The message came through at 6:42 a.m. Just one line on my phone that didn't even use my name. It said the wedding was off, that he'd thought about it overnight, and that texting was easier than talking. I remember staring at the screen, waiting for the rest to load, some explanation or apology, but that was it. And in that silence, my whole body went cold. I'd been engaged to Mark for almost 2 years, and for most of that time, I thought we were building something solid, something calm and adult. I was 32, I worked in logistics for a mid-size import company, and I liked order and plans. Mark was charming in a restless way, always talking about the next big thing, the next move, the next opportunity, and I told myself that was just ambition. We lived together in a rented townhouse, split expenses loosely, and talked often about the life we'd have after the wedding. At least, I talked about it. He nodded, smiled, and let me carry the details. The weeks leading up to that morning had been busy, but not alarming on the surface. Invitations were sent, the venue deposit paid, my dress altered for the second time. His parents were polite but distant, especially his mother, who had a way of smiling while asking questions that felt like inspections. She'd ask about my job, then about my savings, then about whether I planned to keep working once we had children, all in one breath. Mark would squeeze my hand under the table and say nothing, and later tell me I was imagining things. There were small moments I brushed aside because I didn't want to be the woman who overreacted. He started asking more pointed questions about my finances, about the account I'd had since my 20s, about the small condo I'd bought before we met and rented out. He framed it as planning, as wanting transparency before marriage, and I agreed in principle, even as something tightened in my chest. When I asked about his student loans or the credit card he kept saying he'd pay off soon, he'd laugh and say we'd handle it later, together. 2 weeks before the wedding, his tone changed. He became clipped, distracted, spending more time on his phone and less time looking at me when I spoke. One night, as we sat on the couch going over seating charts, he said casually that maybe we should postpone, just to breathe. I asked what he meant, and he shrugged, said pressure made people act weird. The next day, he acted like the conversation never happened, and I told myself nerves did strange things to people. The morning of the text, the house was quiet. His side of the bed was empty, which wasn't unusual since he sometimes left early for the gym, but there was a finality to the way his pillow was propped upright that made my stomach twist. I read the message again, then stood up so fast I felt dizzy. I tried calling him, and it went straight to voicemail. I sent a single reply asking him to talk to me, just to explain, and watched the status stay unread. As shock gave way to a heavy, sinking ache, another feeling crept in, one I hadn't expected. It wasn't just hurt, it was recognition. There had been signs, patterns I'd ignored because loving him felt easier than questioning him. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug I hadn't filled, and thought about the conversation we'd had 3 months earlier, the one that now replayed in my mind with sharp clarity. We'd been discussing merging finances after the wedding, and I'd mentioned, almost offhand, that my name was the only one on my condo and that I liked it that way. He smiled, but his eyes had gone flat for a split second before he joked that marriage meant sharing everything. I'd laughed, said sharing didn't mean erasing, and he'd changed the subject. At the time, I felt proud for holding my ground. Sitting there that morning, I wondered if that moment had mattered more than I realized. By noon, friends started texting, asking if everything was okay, because Mark hadn't shown up to work. I replied vaguely, saying there was a family issue because I wasn't ready to say the words out loud. When his mother called me in the afternoon, her voice was cool, almost relieved. She said Mark needed space, that sometimes men realize things late, and that I should respect his decision. I asked if she knew why he'd ended it by text, and she said that was between us, then added that maybe it was for the best before things got complicated. That night, alone in the house that suddenly felt temporary, I opened my laptop and pulled up my bank statements, my property documents, the spreadsheets I kept more out of habit than fear. I wasn't planning anything yet. I just needed to see my own name, my own numbers, to remind myself that something in my life was still stable. As I scrolled, a notification popped up for my email, a forwarded message Mark must have sent to the wrong address by mistake, and when I read the subject line, my breath caught in my throat. The email was short, written in the brisk, confident tone he used when he thought he was being smart. It was addressed to a man I didn't recognize, and it talked about avoiding future entanglements and making sure assets stayed clean. My name appeared once, almost as an afterthought, followed by a line about how canceling now was better than fighting later. I sat there, reading it over and over, feeling something inside me crack open. Because it wasn't just about cold feet or fear. It was about control. As the shock settled, pieces began to click together in a way that made my hands shake. The questions about my accounts, the sudden interest in timelines, the way his mother had been circling my finances like a polite vulture. I realized that while I'd been planning a marriage, they'd been planning a strategy. And the text wasn't an impulsive act. It was a move. The thought hurt more than the breakup itself, because it meant the man I loved had been evaluating me like a risk. I spent the next 2 days moving through my life on autopilot, canceling vendor meetings, answering concerned messages with half-truths, sleeping in short bursts. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped, but Mark stayed silent. On the 3rd day, his mother showed up at the house unannounced, standing in the doorway with that same practiced smile. She said Mark was overwhelmed and that perhaps it would be best if I moved out quickly to give him peace. She spoke as if the house were already his, as if I were a guest overstaying my welcome. That was the moment something shifted in me, not into rage, but into clarity. I told her calmly that I was on the lease, that I'd paid the last 6 months myself, and that I'd be leaving on my own timeline. Her smile faltered, just slightly, and she said we could discuss it later, but the look in her eyes told me she hadn't expected resistance. After she left, I sat down and cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt like mourning a version of myself that had trusted too easily. Once the tears stopped, I did something I hadn't done in years. I made a plan without telling anyone. I called my lawyer, the same woman who'd helped me buy my condo years earlier, and asked for an urgent appointment. I didn't frame it as revenge or panic. I simply told her my engagement had ended abruptly and that I wanted to protect what was mine. She listened, asked precise questions, and then explained my options in a voice that was steady and reassuring. Over the next week, while Mark stayed unreachable, I followed through quietly. I transferred funds into accounts that were solely under my control, updated beneficiaries, and finalized paperwork I'd postponed because marriage had felt like a safety net. Each signature felt less like an act of defiance and more like reclaiming my footing. I didn't drain anything that wasn't mine, didn't hide money, didn't do anything unethical. I simply made sure that what I'd built stayed attached to my name. Halfway through that process, Mark finally called. His voice was softer than I remembered, threaded with something like regret. He said texting had been cowardly, that he'd been scared, that his head was a mess. He hinted that maybe, after some time, we could talk about what went wrong, about whether this was really the end. I listened without interrupting, feeling strangely detached, and when he finished, I told him I needed space now too. He sounded surprised, as if he hadn't expected me to agree so easily. The real betrayal landed a few days later, when I learned from a mutual friend that Mark had told people I was unstable, that I'd overreacted to normal pre-wedding stress, that canceling had been necessary to protect himself. Hearing my pain reduced to a narrative that made him look reasonable and me look volatile lit a slow, steady fire in my chest. I realized then that if I stayed silent, his version would be the only one that survived. I didn't confront him immediately. I waited until everything was in place, until my lawyer confirmed that the transfers were complete and irreversible. Only then did I agree to meet him, in a neutral cafe near his office, a place with too much light and too many people for drama. He arrived late, looking tired but composed, and as he sat down, he reached for my hand like it was muscle memory. I pulled back gently, and he frowned, as if that small boundary confused him. He started talking about misunderstandings and pressure, about how his parents had concerns, about how maybe we'd rushed things. I let him speak, nodding occasionally, because I wanted to hear how far he'd go. When he finally paused, waiting for me to reassure him, I told him calmly that I'd seen the email. The color drained from his face, and in that silence between us, I saw the truth land. He tried to explain, to say it had been taken out of context, but the words sounded hollow, even to himself. As I stood up to leave, he asked what I was going to do now, and for the first time since the text, I met his eyes without flinching. I told him I was going to move forward and that he didn't need to worry about my finances anymore. He watched me walk away, clearly unsettled, and I knew that whatever he thought he'd secured by ending things, it wasn't going to play out the way he expected. The fallout was quieter than I'd imagined, but no less profound. Word spread that the wedding was officially canceled, and with it came the usual mix of sympathy and curiosity. I didn't correct every rumor or defend myself in every conversation. I focused on practical steps, packing my things, finding a smaller apartment closer to work, redirecting my energy into routines that made me feel grounded. Each box I taped shut felt like a small act of closure. Mark reached out a few more times, alternating between apologies and frustration, especially when he realized I wasn't engaging. At one point, he asked directly whether I'd moved many around, his message careful but probing. I replied simply that my finances were in order and that there was nothing for him to manage. The conversation ended there, and I could almost feel the door closing on his assumptions about me. A month later, I heard through the same mutual friend that Mark was struggling, not financially ruined, not dramatically undone, but unsettled in a way that came from miscalculating someone else's limits. His parents were upset, not about the broken engagement, but about the fact that I hadn't fought, hadn't begged, hadn't left anything behind for them to argue over. I wasn't there to be framed as unreasonable or greedy, and that absence frustrated them more than confrontation would have. The real moment of resolution came unexpectedly, at a small gathering I hadn't planned to attend. A former colleague invited me to a networking event, and I almost declined, still wary of social spaces, but something in me wanted to re-enter the world on my own terms. Halfway through the evening, I ran into Mark's mother. She looked startled to see me, then forced a smile and commented on how well I looked, how resilient. I thanked her politely, and when she mentioned, almost casually, that Mark had been under a lot of stress since the breakup, I told her I hoped he found what he was looking for. There was a pause, heavy and awkward, and then she asked in a voice too light whether I'd sorted out all the financial loose ends. I looked at her and said yes, everything had been transferred and finalized weeks ago, and that it felt good to have clarity. The flicker of surprise on her face was brief, but unmistakable, and in that moment I understood that she'd assumed uncertainty where there was none. I excused myself shortly after, leaving her standing there with questions she couldn't ask. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. I spent evenings cooking simple meals, walking in my neighborhood, reconnecting with parts of myself I'd put on hold. The hurt didn't vanish overnight, and there were moments when I replayed the text in my mind, still stung by its cruelty. But those moments grew fewer, replaced by a quiet confidence that I'd handled the worst of it without losing myself. Looking back, I see now that the cancellation wasn't the betrayal. The betrayal was the assumption that I wouldn't notice, wouldn't protect myself, wouldn't act with intention. By the time Mark realized what he'd lost, not just in terms of money, but in trust and partnership, it was already too late to rewrite the story. I didn't need to confront him publicly or expose him to everyone we knew. The truth had a way of settling where it belonged. I learned that love doesn't require surrendering your footing, and that planning for yourself isn't a lack of faith. When the right person comes along, there won't be secret emails or strategic exits, just conversations that happen face to face. Until then, I'm content knowing that when my world shifted abruptly, I didn't crumble. I stood up, moved what needed to be moved, and walked forward without looking back.